If you're curious and you'd like a more intimate look at arguably the most important civil rights leader of all time, then you're going to enjoy a look at today's book, King a Life by Jonathan Eig. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan. Today we're looking at one of the books that won the Pulitzer Prize for biography. Every year I try to read all the finalists and the winners of the 6 Pulitzer Prize categories, and so far this is one of my favorite books from all of the categories. In this book, we take a look at what is arguably the most important individual in modern American history, especially in the last 60 years. Definitely one of the most important civil rights leaders, and a very complex character as soon as you dig a little deeper. Now, this book is by no means a hagiography. It does spend some time looking at some of the more controversial aspects of Martin Luther King Jr., some of his shortcomings. I would say that almost every other review that I read definitely touched upon that. And so I do think it's worth noting that it does spend a fair amount of time looking at the fact that Martin Luther King Jr. Was a bit of a womanizer. He was known for his extramarital affairs, not just among his family and his close circle, but the FBI was aware of this. As a matter of fact, we've seen this in recent movies and other publications detailing just how much the FBI knew. As a matter of fact, that's one of the reasons why this book was written, is because of the records kept by the FBI were just recently released. That's why Jonathan Eig wrote this book when he did. And I believe there's still some records that are yet to come. I believe the recordings specifically have not been revealed. So there's going to be even more biographies about Martin Luther King Jr., but that's okay because I find him an endlessly fascinating character. And I think that this book does an excellent job at trying to explore a lot of different facets of his life. The other big thing that it discusses is, of course, accusations of plagiarism, including from early on in his life when he had a few speeches where he didn't give proper annotation, or in some cases, he seemed to take significant portions of another already written speech. And then the most famous example of the accusations of plagiarism come from his dissertation. He maybe gave some acknowledgement, but then that by no means is enough to account for lifting 50 sentences. The book's focus actually isn't on these negative elements. It's more focused on his relationships as a whole. And probably the relationship that shows the most vibrantly when you read the book is his relationship with his wife, Coretta Scott King. Coretta Scott King was in her own right an accomplished individual before they got married. She was a very talented singer, and she was very much interested in the civil rights movement. And probably one of the things that the book focuses on that is going to show Martin Luther King Jr. in a more negative light is the fact that he very much was opposed to her being involved. Some could say out of concerns for safety. Martin Luther King Jr. himself not only felt his life was at risk frequently. He on one occasion was attacked, and of course, most famously, he is going to die by assassination. But it also showed that he had a pretty traditional view of marriage, in that Coretta Scott King should stay at home with the children and that she should not be very involved in the civil rights movement. One reason why that's interesting, and even though this book doesn't really deal with it, is of course Coretta Scott King and the rest of the King family is going to play a big part in helping to promote the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. So even though in her lifetime she wasn't heavily involved in the civil rights movement, she definitely went on to play a significant role as she helped to get Martin Luther King Jr. made his birthday made into a federal holiday. And of course, getting the monument in Washington, D.C. around the tidal basin, and just helping to preserve the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., especially in a very positive light. At the time of the death of MLK, he was not a particularly popular character. It showed that he had incredibly low approval ratings. I think it was like 14 or 15%. Unlike nowadays, if you were to poll people on Martin Luther King Jr., I think their approval will probably be somewhere in the 90s plus, although you never know. For some reason, there might be some resurgence of MLK hatred. I don't know. But the point is that he definitely has a more respected opinion currently than he did at the time of his death. Some of the other relationships that the book looks at, not just with Coretta Scott King and, of course, his own children, but also with his own parents, with Martin Luther King Jr. or Martin Luther King Sr. and his mother. It also looks at his relationships with other civil rights leaders, with the Southern Leadership Conference, the NAACP, or other well-known civil rights leaders, probably most famously Malcolm X, and that's one of the stories that it spends a fair amount of time addressing is legacies and understandings about his relationship with Malcolm X and his perceived criticisms of him, which he definitely did have some criticisms, but the book tries to maybe not dispel it entirely, but at least mitigate the sense of harsh criticism of Malcolm X's approach to the civil rights movement. Additionally, and probably one of the uh, more interesting elements of the book that came from the release of the files that the FBI had on MLK was his interaction with LBJ. Well, actually, with all of the different political leaders, JFK, Robert Kennedy, but most famously LBJ, because of course LBJ played a really big role in the civil rights movement, and he played a really big role in the passage of some key parts of the civil rights movement. However, it shows that Martin Luther King Jr. and LBJ did not always get along. LBJ sometimes would try to put a little too much pressure on Martin Luther King Jr. to either refrain from doing something or trying to get his support from Martin Luther King Jr. He seemed to be willing to, well, it was LBJ. He was willing to do whatever to make things work. A real practicer of modern day realpolitik. But the big thing is probably the fact that Martin Luther King Jr. did eventually become critical of certain things like LBJ's escalation of the war in Vietnam, and he just didn't fully buy into a lot of what LBJ was trying to do on an international stage. But they did have a fair amount in common when it came to fighting for civil rights, although they didn't always agree on how to do that. And one of the big things that Martin Luther King Jr. is not as readily remembered for is the fact that he was a big proponent of stuff like the Poor People's Campaign, in which he not only focused on integration, but he really focused on economic disadvantages and trying to use the government to create a more equitable society. That was part of what made him so unpopular by the time of his death, and that's one of the things that the book chooses to really put some focus on. One of the things that I'd say I really took from the book that I hadn't considered before was his efforts beyond the South. Of course, Martin Luther King Jr. is really famous for stuff like the Montgomery bus boycott, his "I Have a Dream" speech, but he had efforts all throughout the United States, and that's of course why he had to interact with other civil rights movements, because he came from a regional civil rights leadership, but there was all sorts of people all across the United States that he needed to work with, and so that gives us a lot of different relationships, and in many cases it actually gives us a lot more failures. One of the things that I didn't know before reading this book was just how unsuccessful he'd been in some of his other efforts, not just at integration, but in other campaigns. And that was actually one of the things that surprised me as the book drew to an end. It started to discuss just how complicated his feelings were about all of the different movements, and how he was really struggling to feel like he was being successful. And then, of course, tragically, when his life was taken, that ended all of his personal efforts. But, and this is something that I want to really spend some time on, his legacy, his death was really only just the beginning of his legacy. A book like this helps us to really consider and really be thoughtful about what exactly is we expect from historical figures. Now, in some cases, we don't want to think of their flaws at all, especially if this is someone that we've already held up as a hero. But I think this book does an excellent job at doing both. It absolutely gives you some of the more negative attributes of Martin Luther King Jr., some of the things that you could very much be critical of. I don't think there's many people out there that are going to tell me that I'm not allowed to be critical of all of his extramarital affairs. Some people might be critical of my interpretation of how he treated Coretta Scott King on the basis that I'm decontextualizing him and taking him out of the 50s and 60s. These are some things that you could have some argument on. But I think what's most important, this is a great tool for showing people how they need to be thoughtful of the people that they really promote from history, and understand that it's not that it's dangerous to put them on a pedestal, it's that they were always human. And so when you want to explore history, and when you want to appreciate history, and you want to appreciate movements in history, it's worth remembering that that movement and the individuals that led that movement were still human. They absolutely still had the flaws that we have in individuals today, and they absolutely made plenty of their own mistakes. And Martin Luther King Jr. is, of course, no different in that regard. So I think it's very important that we're careful when we explore someone like that we don't just disregard that and say, well, that's not important because in the end, the civil rights movement was more important than one man. It is true that the civil rights movement was more important than one man, but it is worth noting that he was a flawed individual and he was flawed in specific ways. I think there's absolutely room for discussion of that. But on the flip side, you cannot discredit a really important movement simply because you can now find fault with one of the leading figures of that movement. And I think that's also something that has to be remembered when you're engaging with history. As a historian, I loved this book. I thought it was very well done. I thought that it was written in an easy to understand manner. It is a big book. It is over 600 pages. I think it's like 20 hours plus of listening if you listen to the audiobook, but I was never bored. I thought that it was a very easy book to take in. I would highly recommend this book for anyone that has any interest whatsoever in modern American history, in the civil rights movement, or if you're just interested in a mountain of a man when it comes to major movements in modern America. The only people that I probably wouldn't recommend this book for are probably is anyone that is going to struggle with reading about his extramarital affairs, his accusations of plagiarism. If that's going to bother you, then this book's not for you. But I would highly recommend that you learn how to engage with that because that's history, that's life. Nobody that you're going to study was perfect. And so if you want to hold up anyone, you're going to quickly find flaws that are really going to disappoint you if that's how you're going to approach history. Of course, I really want to know what everyone else has to say about this book, whether you agree with me, disagree with me, whether this review has inclined you to read it or disinclined you to read it, one or the other. Just let me know in the comments. And of course, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on those notifications so you don't miss any more reviews from me. Thank you for watching. Spencer reads everything. And until next time, keep those pages turning.